Okay. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of In Sickness and in Health. And today you are talking with Stephanie, clinical manager for the Traveling Therapist, and Yalily Smith, owner of the Traveling Therapist. So, today, between my therapist and I, the final installment, we're actually going to be discussing what happens after our loved one has passed. And it's going to include a lot of elements of grief, healthy grieving process, what is complicated grief, unresolved grief, what are some of the coping tools that you can do to have a healthy grieving process. And we're actually also going to talk a little bit about what if the caregiver is the one that passed away and the patient actually stayed alive, and it was completely unexpected, and it was actually you thought you were going to go because you were the patient, and instead the person that was caring for you almost 24 hours a day was the one who passed.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get started. Okay, so now we've covered all of the from initial diagnosis all the way to now the person has essentially passed. And let's start with the caregiver losing their loved one, which is the patient in this case. What would you say are some of the signs that a person can start identifying in themselves of complicated / unresolved grief?
I mean, for me, I think the biggest one would be like an inability to move forward with life. Like if you're still on the same schedule that you had when the person was still alive, that's probably a pretty big sign.
Yeah.
Because you should be shifting it up, especially if you weren't sleeping well and things like that, and you're still doing that. Or almost we talk about PTSD when it's like trauma and people have nightmares and they wake up. So not necessarily the nightmare part, but if you had to get up 3-4 times in the night to help that person either go to the bathroom or just they couldn't sleep well because of pain or whatever, if you're still waking up at those intervals because that's just what you do, but there's not anyone there anymore.
Now, I will say there's a slippery slope to that, because there is a transitional time when the body does have to readjust. The circadian rhythm has to readjust. The person's just natural everyday schedule has to readjust.
Yeah, so your body gets used to schedules.
Yes.
And so there would be a level of it that's that. So then I think with that example, it would be more of a time thing. If it's been, a year and that's still happening, there's some unresolved stuff there.
And also thinking about that psychologically, if there is a reluctance to try to help yourself to change.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes to really have a healthy grieving process, most people seek out counsel and help just to find out, am I doing it right? Does this feel right? You go to grief groups, you go to your therapist, you even maybe ask your PCP. There's all kinds of other friends, families, et cetera, if you're noticing along these lines, if you're noticing that not only are you not changing the old habits and the old behaviors, but it almost feels like you just can't do it. It doesn't feel right to do it. It doesn't feel right to move on, because it means you're going to be moving on and therefore potentially forgetting the person.
Yeah.
So if you are associating change with guilt, shame, I say that's your sign. If it's been 3 months and you're still kind of having a hard time, you get up in the middle of the night, or maybe you're very sensitive to sound, maybe you're very sensitive to light, things like that, but you've been actively working on it,
Yeah.
You have maybe a therapist that's helping you with coping tools, all these different things, and you're aware of it, and you're thinking, I know that this is happening, but I'm working on it. That's different. That's different.
I agree. But I think that's with any of the signs or even any of the coping skills or anything, there's always that line.
Yes. Another big one for me that I've noticed is what I call the impossible questions. So you fall into this loop of why, how, why did it have to happen? It's not fair. How is it that we ended up this way? That loop of impossible questions of, for example, why did he have to suffer or she had to suffer? Why did they have to get sick in the first place? Why couldn't we have more life together? Why did, the impossible questions. Did I do the right thing? Did I treat them well enough? Did I do enough for them? Did I, that to me is the deepest hole that a person can dig for themselves when it comes to unresolved grief, because it is unstoppable. You're never going to get the answers that you want.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen. You're never going to be satisfied with any answer that anybody gives you.
Right.
And you're going to literally use those questions to beat yourself every day, hours and hours and hours through the day, because of the fact that you can't get the answer for it.
I think that's one of those things that's another line situation again, because they are all normal. They're normal thoughts, they're normal questions. And I think there is a time and place that needs to be the phase you're in. But you can't stay stuck there. So that's, again, where you have to be seeking help to learn how to come out of those, because they are unanswerable questions. But then also, I think sometimes, especially right after maybe the person passes, that can be a flare-up of those. Because some of those, why did it have to be this way? Why did they have to suffer all of this? You may have had those thoughts all along, but you were never able to sit with them because you didn't have the capacity to sit with them. Especially depending on from diagnosis till death, what the progression of the disease. Some people, it's really faster in the trenches. But even if it's a slow process, it's a trauma basically to even get here that your person is diagnosed with something, and that could be hard for you to digest. And so you can't deal with that. I can't deal with thinking about how this person just got diagnosed with this because I need to care for them, or I need to treasure the time that we have left and all of that. And so those thoughts sometimes I feel don't even come up until after the person is gone.
Yes, and then you have that time to dwell, and you have the idleness is the worst.
Yeah, and I think that's why that's sometimes when they finally come up, because your brain and body is finally okay, now we can sit and stew in these thoughts that we couldn't before.
Yeah. Something that most people don't believe is that the first 3 weeks or so, you are in almost like a tunnel where everything is revolving around the funeral and around family and answering questions and and it's just you're on survival mode, and it's putting one foot in front of the other, and essentially you don't think. You just focus and you push because it has to be done. So you just do what you have to do. You don't stop. And so during those times, what you see more commonly is people asking, why am I not crying? Why haven't I felt sad yet? Why haven't I feel like maybe I'm betraying their memory because I go to sleep at night and I fall asleep. Well, trust and believe that you're in the process, but during those first several weeks, your brain is not thinking about emotions or grief. It's only focused on survival. So don't expect yourself to jump immediately into grief, and especially not immediately into healing, because you're going to be distracted with a million different things that have to do with everyday tasks that you have to complete. So that's definitely something that I see often is people like, I don't get it. Why haven't I started, you know, I haven't cried. I haven't done anything that I thought was appropriate for grief.
Yeah.
And that's also where you don't ask those questions yet.
Yeah.
Then the 3 weeks go by. The funeral's done. The flowers stop coming. The phone calls stop coming.
Yeah.
You've told everybody that was absolutely necessary.
Normally all the affairs are taken care of by that point, like paperwork and all that.
Most of the affairs are done and over with. And then there's the silence. And then it's just you in the house. Or even if you have more than one person in the house, maybe you have your children in the house, there's the silence of your responsibility is gone and now your purpose is gone.
Yeah, it's still a large chunk of your life, or, you know, who knows how long. Normally it's a few years at least. That's just not there now. So
a part of grief which may very quickly become unhealthy is the part where you start to question your purpose and you start to wonder, why am I still here? You know, should I just go to a nursing home? Should I just go away from my family? Because I don't know who I am. I don't know what I like. I don't know what what I'm used to anymore. I had a routine. I did it for years, and now it's over. So, okay. How do you combat unhealthy grief, and very importantly, how do you avoid it from the beginning? I think the number one thing that I usually tell people is, if I can catch you before the actual end, if I start to see you before the end comes, I always reinforce the idea of start exploring your own identity. Do your best to start working on exploring who you are despite the caregiver role, beyond the caregiver role. You know, read books that you might enjoy reading, even if it's a chapter that you get, you only can get one chapter, or you have to do audiobooks or whatever. Explore hobbies that you might have an interest in, even if it's a little bit at a time, but don't stop trying to also maintain, and if you haven't found it, find your identity as well. Yeah. And what else do you think? Positive coping, preventative coping?
I would think it would be to change at least one small thing in the routine, like right off the bat, and kind of like, because then that's a buildable plan, because you can do that for a few weeks and then add a second thing that you can switch up. And I mean, it can be like small, like if it's that you got up at a certain time in the morning and immediately had to start caring for that person, you don't have to now. So instead, maybe first thing is you hop in a hot shower, or you get to make coffee and just sit and enjoy that cup of coffee, and you never could do that before. Like little things like that aren't a huge, like big change, but it's just something a little bit different, but it's also kind of like a self-care thing.
Yes. I would say maybe start relying on lists.
Yeah.
Like you do like a list the night before of maybe 5 things to get accomplished that day. And maybe one of those things is something positive for yourself.
Yeah.
Whether it's go for a walk, whether it's preferably leave the house.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. Like, because even like with the coffee, like I know not everybody, most of the people watching this probably live in Florida, and
we love coffee.
Yeah, but if you live somewhere like that, or depending on the time of year, like don't just sit at the kitchen table and dwell on everything that's gone in the house. Like at least go outside, like go out in the backyard and sit down, or go out on the lanai and sit down and have coffee, or take a walk around the neighborhood, or whatever. Yeah.
Reach out to friends, reconnect with people that maybe you weren't able to connect with before. I wouldn't say immediately start to travel. Maybe you're not in a place to travel, but like if you can go for breakfast, brunch, whatever with a friend that's local, start working on on increasing your socialization.
Because any little change is going to be big. So if you can keep the scenery somewhat the same as far as like staying in the same town, at least for, the first month or so.
Yeah. Also, in terms of socialization, there's a lot of groups and different activities that you can look for in the community, and especially like for older adults. There's card groups, there's bingo groups, there's...
Oh yeah, and like, I know here in Florida especially, we have a lot of 55 plus communities, so, and you don't necessarily have to live there to go and sometimes enjoy the amenities that they have. So you can do stuff like that.
Yeah, there's activities in the area that you can look for. So try to, the moral of that story is do your best to start reintroducing yourself to society.
Yeah. Creating a new routine, building a new life, basically.
Yeah, it's because it's pretty much almost guaranteed that if you spend a long period of time caring for someone almost all the time, your social life probably took a tumble, big time.
Yep.
Another thing is a lot of grief happens in the mind. So remember that everything that you do and everything that you think, you're doing it for yourself. The funeral was for you and the family. The grief is for you. The coping is for you. The self-care is for you. It's all for you. The person that you love is no longer physically in this world, and therefore they're not affected by human emotions. They don't need for you to feel guilty or sad or angry or ashamed or anything like that. Whatever you do, any ritualistic behaviors, whether it's lighting candles, whether it's making sure that you go to the grave every single day, whether it's whatever you do, it's for you. And focus on that mentality, because oftentimes the grief is in our minds and we're thinking we should be feeling a certain way to justify our love for this person. And that's not how that works. You love that person. That was just self-evident.
Yeah, or having to hold on to the anger that this is how it went, or because they had to suffer. And it's like, but none of that's happening anymore. So it's going to just make you suffer now.
Yeah. So a lot of what you're going to do to have a healthy grieving process, which does exist, is is challenging those types of thoughts and challenging the instinct to self-destruct and to self-harm mentally and physically, whether it's by refusing to go to sleep at night because you're staying up late thinking about that person and everything that happened, and reviewing every mistake you ever made and everything that ever happened and every moment in the bed before they passed away, and all those things. Whether it's that, whether it's not eating properly because of the grief, whether it's not going outside the house, isolating yourself, all those things. Most of your grieving process is going to be you challenging whether that's the best thing or not, whether that's necessary or not, whether that's healthy or not. I was also thinking about when you're in that process, whether it's a lot of people always ask how long is it healthy to grieve? What would you say to that?
I hate that question.
I know, right?
There isn't one.
It's hard not to chuckle because it's
Yeah, everyone's different, and it's I think really the only way that it's unhealthy is it's not a timing thing. It's more so how are you living, and are you for the most part, happy. Like, are you still having moments of grief? Yeah, of course. But I think that's always going to be there to some extent. So there is no timeline.
Yeah.
Again, like if you're just laying in bed and doing nothing with your life for 3 years, that's unhealthy. But that's not grief at that point. That's taking it to a whole other level.
Yeah. And that's a good point that you make. Learn to identify the difference between grief and depression. Two very different things. Grief is a completely natural thing. Our bodies are designed to go through that process. We have a clear understanding psychologically from the moment of birth that death will happen. And so it's part of living. So most people think, oh, I feel sad and I keep crying and I can't stop crying and I can't stop feeling sad, so I'm depressed. Grief is not depression. Grief can turn to depression if it's not healthy grieving, and if it's not done properly, it can turn into depression, but grief is not depression. And it concerns me sometimes when I see people that are so quick to go straight to the antidepressant to alleviate their grief, because it's like you're not coping with the grief. You're not actually processing the grief. You're putting a Band-Aid over the grief, and grief cannot be stopped. It's not like depression. Depression is a chemical imbalance in your brain, which can be changed through chemicals like medication so that you start to feel better. But grief doesn't work that way.
Well, and I mean, depression's normal. A lot of people have it, but it is like a chemical imbalance, right? It's something not working the way that it needs to work.
Yes.
Grief is not that. Grief is just a part of the human experience. It's very natural. It's biological. Right. Everybody, and since the world has existed, has had some form of grief that we go through when people pass away.
Yeah. So when I talk to people about it, and they ask me like, well, should I just go to the psychiatrist and get some pills?
No.
I normalize grief. You should be crying.
Yes.
You should be feeling sad. You should not want to get out of bed. You should cry in really weird moments for unexpected reasons. Things that you're literally maybe like holding a bottle of detergent and you in the middle of Walmart and you start to burst into tears, and it's like, I remember the scent, of this detergent makes me think of when I used to wash their clothes, and it's just like, boom, there you are crying in the middle of Walmart.
Yeah.
And that's okay. These things are normal. We grieve with every single one of our senses.
Right. So
know that most of the things that you're going to do while you're grieving are actually really natural. They're to be expected. It's okay for you to cry once a day, every day, for months at a time. It's okay for you to burst into tears at random times. It's okay for you to feel angry, for you to feel, upset, frustrated. I mean, all of it is, my gosh, I remember when I worked at hospice. I remember working at hospice and literally seeing, I had a person who the spouse was the caregiver. My patient passed away.
Okay.
The spouse, one day I went to visit, it was right after the death. She just lost herself in the grief and just laid down on the floor in the fetal position and just sobbed. And some people may say, that's not normal. You shouldn't get to that extreme. I was like,
yeah, you should. Yeah.
I literally laid down next to her. I just laid on the ground with her. And I rubbed her back very gently. And I told her, just let it out. Just let it out. This is how it works. This is how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that you're going to do when you're grieving are going to seem really weird, are going to seem really inappropriate. They're not going to seem socially acceptable. I promise you, 90% of them are. I promise you, it's most likely not depression. If you are experiencing depression because of your grief, what you're most likely going to be looking at is, again, you refuse to change your routine, isolate from the world, stop eating or eat too much, you're sleeping an unhealthy amount of hours a day. And yes, you will be sleeping a lot at the beginning because you're going to be catching up.
Yeah.
So you are going to be sleeping a lot at the beginning. You're going to be like, why am I sleeping like literally like 12 hours every night? And I wake up and I'm still tired. And well, yes, for the first probably like 3 months, you're going to sleep more than you're used to. That's okay. Your body's exhausted. It just literally like was on hyper alertness for years.
Well, grief is exhausting too.
And grief is exhausting. But if you're sleeping to where it's like, I don't want to wake up.
Yeah. And like, yeah, like thoughts of like, what's the point now of even living and like things like that.
Yeah. Thoughts of wanting to be dead. Thoughts of wanting to
Again, some of that can also be normal with the grief, I think, in the beginning. But it's like, how often are they coming? How very seriously are you feeling that way?
Yes. And if there's any sort of attempts, there's definitely your sign.
Yeah. If you're making plans, all that kind of stuff, then we're talking more depression side.
Yeah. So know the difference between the two. Be mindful of not rushing into trying to band-aid the grief and trying to fix the grief. You're not broken.
No, you need to have compassion for yourself like you would somebody else that is grieving too.
Yes, yes. Tremendous amount of patience and grace. And then the final part that I want to touch on is obviously the fact that now you're going to be tackling a lot of the daily tasks and a lot of the responsibilities entirely on your own. It might have happened that you may have had even a little bit of support from your loved one to the very end, and now you're essentially completely handling everything on your own. And so my suggestion with that is take it bite-sized pieces and reach out to resources. Get to know the resources in your area. Get yourself a reliable handyman. Get yourself make sure that you have your accountant. Make sure that you have, if you're going to be preparing for your will or making changes, things like that, make sure that you have a trusted legal advisor. Make sure that you understand that you have a relationship with your bank. Like, all of those things, start going out and setting and developing relationships. Get help. Don't be afraid to get help. If your loved one happened to be, for example, the handyman of the house the entire time to the very end, you need a handyman. If they were still able to do the lawn, well, now you need a lawn person. Or if you are a male caregiver and you had your wife pass away and she still cooked, for example, or she still did a lot of the cleaning in the house, then you're going to need to find help. Get somebody to come over to the house once every couple weeks, once a month, to do some of the heavy lifting with the cleaning. Get maybe like people in the community, maybe at your church, that can help you for the first few months. Build community resources and talk to people, and don't do it all alone, because you're going to feel very alone. Yeah. Okay. So now the final thing is, what happens if it was the caregiver who passed away and you're the patient and you're still end of life, or you're still very, very sick, chronically ill,
right?
What are the options there, and what does grief look like at that point?
I mean, options are going to depend on where you're at. So you're either maybe already in like a nursing facility or hospice, even maybe at that point, depending on, again, where you're at on the journey. But then that may need to be the next step if you're not.
Yeah.
Or hiring a caregiver, like an in-home nurse or another family member that's supposed to come in and do that, something.
Yeah. It's really sad, but unfortunately, your grief is going to be coupled with also whatever emotional turmoil you were experiencing has been someone with a chronic illness or end of life illness.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not the time to be thinking about your pride or, oh, I don't deserve this. This is not right. This is unfair, etc., etc. Like, for you to be able to have a healthy grieving process, and I mean, talk about guilt and shame,
Mm-hmm.
because inevitably you're going to probably ask yourself, I mean, I would be surprised if it didn't happen. You're going to ask yourself if you were at fault in some way.
Mm-hmm.
The guilt and the shame is takes on a completely different view, because you very well may feel like you were partially responsible for this person
Mm-hmm.
becoming more sick or they're then not being able to be alive right now.
Mm-hmm.
So for you to be able to start processing grief, you have to have your hierarchy of needs met first and foremost. So this is where you put aside your pride and you start to think, what is the most realistic move that I can make to take care of myself? It might be I have to sell the house, leave, and go to an assisted living because my family member can't take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might be I have to move in with my family members, even if I feel like I'm imposing or I feel bad or whatever. I'm sorry. It's one of those terrible, terrible moments where you have to decide what is real versus what is something that you wish would happen, because it can be two very different things.
Well, yeah, and that's the circumstance is still going to be there no matter what you want it to be. So
yeah, and be very, very careful. Whatever negative emotions you've already been experiencing through the process of being sick, it's going to be multiplied.
Yeah.
Double, triple, quadruple.
And your health can take a turn for the worst again, because they have done like links between your mind, what you think, what you feel emotionally is tied to our health. So just like high stress levels, we can get sicker. So
yes,
that's why it's important to get the right care for yourself, because it's just like your health could take a turn.
Yes, I think that a caregiver who loses their loved one is, I would say they can get away with doing maybe like a grief group and be okay.
Yeah.
I definitely think if you're a patient who just lost someone that cared for you and is also the dual role of your life partner, you need to have a trained professional helping you through this process. You need to have someone with experience in grief work, because there's so many things combined. If you were already experiencing depression, if you were already experiencing OCD, if you were already experiencing anxiety, and on top of that, now you have the grief, and on top of that, life adjustment, where before you were convinced that you were going to be the first one to go, and you were going to go maybe in the home where you and your spouse lived for however many years.
That's the thing. Not that there's never any concern whenever you're the patient at all about this, but it's going to increase. Like your somewhat sense of safety and stability is gone now. And maybe even like trust to a degree. Because I mean, like there's not a lot when you're that sick of like, who are you going to trust more than anyone to take care of you? Your partner. Yeah. And now that's gone.
Yeah.
And you may have to trust strangers now to take care of you.
Yes. So definitely strongly recommend that you go to a professional that has experience with grief, preferably one that has experience with grief and like complicated grief and maybe chronic terminal illnesses. Because you're going to want to process a lot of very complicated changes in your life that are going to happen. A lot of really difficult decisions are going to have to be made, things that you weren't expecting to have to make. So that's our absolute biggest recommendation for someone who is a patient that lost a caregiver / loved one. Any final thoughts?
I think so.
Okay. Grief, again, natural part of life. It's okay. It's not comfortable. It's not something that you're ever going to say, well, I enjoyed that process. But it is most certainly a necessary process. It's part of loving a person. You do not do them any favors by becoming self-destructive for the sake of your grief. I promise you, they're not going to be grateful to see your great sacrifice or what you're giving up to demonstrate how much you love them. It's not how it works. That's not what they would have wanted if they were alive. So be mindful of those tricky little thoughts that might get into your head telling you that you don't deserve to take care of yourself, you don't deserve to get back into the community, you don't deserve to be happy again, or at least to have a peaceful life or a good life. It's not true. Mm-hmm. It's not true. Be brave enough to challenge that. Don't believe everything that your mind conjures up, because it's not always real. And with that said, I hope you guys like the series. I hope that you guys found it helpful. If you have any comments, any feedback, we'd love to hear back from you guys. If you like this kind of content, as always, let us know. And this is it for us at Between My Therapist and I. Have a wonderful day. And happy holidays to everyone.
Bye, guys.